What do you think the power limit is on a completely stock EJ25 engine? Not talking driveline, not talking fuel system, just the stock block and heads. How much power can you make on that engine? Some people say 400, heard 450, maybe even 500. But what I'm going to tell you today is that you should not be concerned about the peak power level. You should be concerned about the peak torque level when you're concerned with engine durability. All right, so when we talk about the maximum power in a stock engine, let's first do a definition here. What do we mean by stock? We're talking about stock block, means stock rods, stock cranks, stock pistons, stock rings, stock gaskets, stock heads, in most cases also stock cam and stock valve springs, but we can talk about that some more later. So what defines the limit for a stock engine? What's usually going to break first? It depends upon the engine. For example, on a lot of Subarus, we usually see it's either going to be ringlands or rod bearings, right? We don't see a lot of broken rods on those engines. But all these failures are due not to power, but to torque. I'm sure it's going to be controversial for some people, but let's talk about why. Well, power isn't really a measure of actual stress. Power is actually torque integrated over time. What's the equation for that? Well, power, and if we're measuring in imperial units, in horsepower, right, is going to be equal to torque multiplied by RPM over a constant of 52. That's why you see on a dyno graph, if the torque and horsepower both have the same scale, they will always cross at 52 if they're in pound-feet and horsepower. Basically, the more torque we make at higher RPMs, the more power we make. So if our torque curve is completely flat, so this is going to be torque here, and this is RPM, okay? If we have a torque curve that comes up like this and say at 3,000 to 7,000 is flat, what's the power curve going to look like? Well, the power curve, if this is power over here, is going to look basically like this, okay? So what that means then is that if we can make the same torque at higher RPMs, we can make more power. And torque is really a better measurement of stress for your engine. Why is that? Well, torque is basically what's happening with the cylinder pressure in the bore, right? So when we have a combustion event occur, cylinder pressure builds, it pushes down on that piston and rod, right? That rod connects to the crankshaft, so what you have is a lever arm, right? So the longer the lever, the more torque you get. So the more pressure we have, the more torque we get as well. So if I have 300 pound-feet of torque, or I have 400 pound-feet of torque, well, my stresses at peak torque are going to be about 33% higher with 400 pound-feet of torque, right? Now, but if I make that 400 pound-feet of torque at 6,000 RPM or 3,000 RPM, the actual compressive stresses, the cylinder pressures, aren't any different. We're just doing it twice as often. That has some effects on head studs and gaskets, but in terms of actual strength of, say, your cylinder bore, your cylinder walls, your piston, your rod, your bearings, all those sorts of things, it really isn't that different from the engine's perspective. So when we talk about what the max power is on an EJ25, you'll hear people say 400, 450, rarely hear more than 500 being quoted around, but we know, not just from what we've done, but from what some other tuners have done as well, that you can actually make a lot more power on a stock EJ25. Because when we break EJ25 motors, again, it's usually not the rods breaking, right? It's usually going to be something with the ringlands or the piston rings, or perhaps also bearings. And that's often due more to issues with detonation, which is, bad cylinder events, which it could be due to your fueling, could be due to, bad tuning, who knows. More than the fact that we're actually putting too much torque into something where we're bending or breaking a rod or having a problem with a rod bearing from that. Now, that's why high-revving engines tend to have a really easy time making a lot more power with boost. To use some examples, I happen to have an S2000. We have done completely stock F20 and F22 engines on S2000s in excess of 700 wheel horsepower. That sounds like an amazing amount of power, right? But remember, that engine revs to 9,000 RPM. So if I have a 9,000 RPM engine, this is 9,000, and this is going to be my power limit up here, so this will be power. Well, if I'm making 300 pound-feet of torque on that S2000, so let's do torque over here. So if I'm making 300 pound-feet of torque, and I make that pretty much flat above a certain point, well, at 9,000 RPM, if you do our equation up here, 9,000 over 52 is going to be approximately 1.65 multiplied by torque. Well, now we're going to have, what, almost 500 horsepower with just 300 pound-feet of torque. So we're all the way up to 500 horsepower up here. So that's going to be pretty amazing, right? 500 horsepower. So what's it going to take for us to get to 700 horsepower? Well, at 9,000 RPM, we're only going to need about another 110, 120 pound-feet of torque. So 400 and say 25 pound-feet of torque will get us up to 700 horsepower. So when you think about that, that's not much torque, right? That's a 2-liter engine. And in fact, we make 425 pound-feet of torque on completely stock EJ25s with just E85 and some injectors, right? So if the EJ25 can handle that, well then why can't the F20 handle it? The difference is the F20 can make that torque for much, much, much longer, and therefore can make more power. Same thing applies to, say, a Coyote engine. 8,000 RPM, 500 pound-feet of torque, that's 750 wheel horsepower, right? That's not a lot of torque. That same 500 pound-feet of torque on a LT1 at 6,000 RPM is only going to generate about 575 horsepower. So it really makes a difference if we can keep that torque low and rev it out. Now, of course, you can't rev every engine out to 8,000, 9,000 RPM. On a stock EJ25, most people don't like to go over 7,200 RPM. But even then, let's just imagine that we have an EJ25, we're revving it to 7,200 RPM, but due to a combination of our turbo, and maybe we upgrade the camshafts and intake manifold as well to help us out, we're able to produce 400 pound-feet of torque at 7,200 RPM. What's that going to generate for us? Well, that's going to basically be about 1.4 times the torque. So 400 pound-feet of torque up there would be 560 horsepower at 7,200 RPM. And yet the stresses on that motor are going to be very low relative to, basically a stock turbo setup, because we're not making any more torque. Our peak cylinder pressures aren't any higher. We're just doing it more frequently. I mean, that sounds like a lot of information, and there are other things to consider as well. But if we manage our torque carefully and don't sit there and bring in a massive amount of torque that might break something, then we can make a lot of power safely on stock or relatively stock engines. All right, so we've talked a little bit about power and torque. Let's talk a little bit about what we have to worry about when it comes to failure modes on our engine. We already talked a little bit about ring lands and bearings, but you rarely hear about someone breaking a rod on an engine. We always hear, for example, on, say, LS3 engines that the max horsepower you want to see on an engine like that is 700, 750 wheel horsepower. Above that, you're just going to break something. But typically when it breaks, it's rarely a rod, rarely a connecting rod. In fact, most engines that we do, if you're pushing the limits of that engine, it's not a rod. Sometimes on, say, an older B-Series engine from Honda, it might be a sleeve if it's a B20. Other engines, you might have problems with the pistons holding up to that high pressure. Sometimes they will actually crack or fall apart, especially if they're cast pistons. That becomes a problem on, say, some of the higher revving VQ engines at high revs and high power levels. But rarely is it actually a connecting rod. And there's a reason for that. So a connecting rod looks something like this, okay? And this is what we call the big end, and up here is the small end. So this is where your piston's gonna go, okay? Now, when that rod is in compression, when the engine is actually producing cylinder pressure, what's happening? Well, the cylinder pressure acts on the top up here and is pushing down on that connecting rod. So it's actually in compression at that point, and the connecting rod is very, very strong in compression. You've got a big beam of steel here, okay? In most cases, we do aluminum for race motors. And you'll see on the beefier connecting rods from something like, say, an S2000 or a Coyote or most modern engines now that rev out, they'll have very beefy shoulders here, very thick, very, very high quality material. So they don't tend to break in compression. What we might see a problem is if we rev an engine too high over its normal limit, is that we will see a problem down here in the big end, but not with the rod itself, but with the connecting rod bolts, okay? These connecting rod bolts here are in very high stress. They're in tension at high RPMs, because when that piston is coming up and down, when it comes up to the top, it's got to stop basically. And especially in the exhaust stroke, there's nothing to stop it. So those rods are in tension, and then those connecting rod bolts can break. That's a common failure. The only type of failure we typically see on modern engines when we're talking about making a lot of torque, again, is not the rod itself, but we will see problems in the piston. So if this is a piston right here, and we look at the side of the piston, okay, you're going to have something called rings that go around that piston. So you have a top and upper and lower compression ring, and then a lower oil ring. The oil ring's not too important. That usually doesn't break, and even if it does, it's not usually catastrophic. But the compression rings, well, that's a problem. And we don't actually usually break the rings. What usually happens is we break the ring land here. Now, one thing you have to understand is when you have a piston ring, it actually has a gap in it. So if this is our piston ring, it's going to look like this, and at the end there's going to be a very small gap, okay? That's our gap right there, and that would be measured in thousandths of an inch typically, not very much. And the reason there's a gap there is that piston ring actually will expand as it gets hotter and hotter. So as we run more and more power, we're going to have more and more cylinder pressure, more and more heat in that cylinder, and if that heat gets to be too high, then that gap will close up, and if it closes up completely and those ring ends butt together, then it's going to typically cause stress on that ring land, which is right here. Okay, this is the ring land here where the ring goes, and it's typically going to cause that ring land to break. So it's very common for us to see a problem where you see the top of the piston here, and you will see where the ring butted together, you'll see a chunk out of the top of the piston. You actually be able to see the ring underneath it. That, of course, is a pretty catastrophic failure. Engines will still run after that happens, but it's pretty much done. The cylinder wall is scored, the piston's broken, there's usually debris in the engine. But that's a problem from too much heat rather than too much power. So, too much heat in the cylinder, and it's really not a problem if we just add more ring gap, right? But most factory engines don't run a lot of ring gap because that means increased pollution. The other place we tend to see a lot of failures is in our rod bearings right there. So that rod bearing actually consists of two halves, multiple materials, all layered together to provide a highly slippery surface that's also going to hold oil, right? Because what happens is this is between the crankshaft and the rod, and it's designed to be a barrier to protect both those surfaces. And we actually have oil being pumped into there at high pressure. And ideally, those surfaces should never touch. The idea is that everything is riding on a hydrodynamic wedge of oil inside the surface there. Now, if we make a lot of power, or especially a lot of torque, let's be correct about it, that torque is a pressure pushing down onto that rod bearing, right? So when we have a combustion event occur, pressure pushes down the rod to here to this bearing. So now, if we don't have good oil or enough oil pressure, what's going to happen then is it's going to want to move this whole rod down, and it's going to want to take up that gap. So the top end of this top bearing right here will typically be what fails. So if we were to look at the two bearing halves, the top half would be here like this, bottom half's here like this, almost nowhere here, but you will see scoring and wear on the top half, right? And that's because we are pushing that rod down and we're basically squeezing all the oil out. Now you can go to heavier oil, you can run higher oil pressure. There's a few different things you can do. Sometimes it even means going to a whole different bearing design if you're going to push an engine way past where you want it to be. But oiling is really, really important. So again, not really a structural failure of the engine at high power, at high torque. It's more a failure of our oiling system, right? Or our lack of proper oil, or maybe oil cooling. If our oil gets too hot, it's going to get thin as well. So if you take care of all these things then, well, where does this rod actually fail at? Most factory engines will usually handle a substantial amount of torque above and beyond what they're delivered with without any issues. Is it safe to say that every engine can handle twice the rated torque? Maybe not, but certainly 50% more? Yeah, absolutely. And depending upon the engine build and the quality of the engine, it might be able to get to twice the rated torque. I certainly know F20C engines, for example. My Honda S2000 is producing about 100% more torque than factory right now. So, and it's still the original 26-year-old engine, still running great. Would I be happy producing twice the rated torque on, say, an LS or an LT motor? Probably not. You know, we'd be talking about a 1,300 pound-feet of torque LT4 motor, which is probably a little bit high on stock components. We can get close to it, but I would much rather make 1,000 pound-feet of torque and make it at a higher RPM, which is why LS and LT motors respond so well to camshafts. But yeah, if we manage that torque, we can do some pretty amazing things, which brings me to something else to consider too. When you're asking about how much power or how much torque an engine can handle, you need to ask yourself, how much is the engine actually producing versus what you're actually seeing? What do I mean by that? Well, a naturally aspirated engine, the power you're producing is pretty much the power you're seeing at the output, whether it's measured on an engine dyno or a chassis dyno. But when you start to add boost, you got to ask yourself, am I actually having to produce more power than what I'm actually seeing? What do I mean by that? Well, turbochargers are basically free power. We're not putting a lot more stress on the engine, not having to produce extra power to drive that turbo, because it's driven by wasted exhaust heat to begin with. That's why turbochargers tend to be better for fuel economy, tend to be better for maximum power. However, if we're running a supercharger, ask yourself, where is the power to drive that supercharger coming from? Well, yeah, it's coming from the crankshaft. So we have an accessory belt driven off the crankshaft to that supercharger, and that means that supercharger is always drawing some power. Now, different superchargers have different ways of mitigating that. Most modern roots-type blowers have a bypass valve, so if you're just idling or cruising, there's very minimal power being drawn. Centrifugal superchargers at low RPMs aren't spinning very fast, so their draw is relatively low, and they also tend to be more efficient. For something like a 2650 positive displacement blower, that supercharger, when it's producing enough airflow for 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 horsepower, is drawing in excess of 100 horsepower for the crankshaft. So what does that mean? Well, if I have a 1,000 horsepower wheel horsepower engine on a 2650, that probably means I'm producing how much power at the flywheel? Oh, maybe it's 1,150, right? But also, that flywheel horsepower is not the actual power the engine has to produce. We need to produce another 100 horsepower, so now we're up to 1,250 horsepower when we talk about actual power that's having to be produced by the engine. We just don't see 100 of that because it's being sucked away by the supercharger. So at the same power level, at the wheels or at the flywheel, a supercharged engine is actually going to be under more stress than a turbocharged engine because we have to drive that extra power out to produce that actual boost pressure. So there's no free lunch, but when it comes to a supercharger, it costs us more than it does with a turbocharged setup. All right, so we covered a lot of information in a very short period of time, and we could do hours and hours on this topic. We could talk about bearing materials, lubrication systems, all kinds of good stuff. But let's go back to the original statement here. How much power can a stock engine make. It's not about power, it's about torque. And if you manage the torque and produce it higher in the RPM range, whatever it's going to take to do that, you can produce a tremendous amount of power on factory components. Just keep those peak cylinder pressures down, stretch it out over as much RPM as possible, and have fun.